right? So if we're standing on the beach at 70 degrees Fahrenheit with 20% humidity is where they actually come up with this number, right? So what this means is 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel should give us optimum fuel propagation. In other words, optimum fuel burn. That's the right air-fuel mixture ratio, so it burns well. Okay, so this is pretty simple. I've got, right. So really, you could calculate this out and be, well, if this is 14.7, and we could do some math just to make the math simple. We could say we'll just say it's 10 to 1 for mathematics sakes. That if this was 10, that whole size better be 1. So we have, right? So we have a 10 to 1 ratio. In this case, it's a 14.7 to 1 ratio. That's how big the jet would have to be relative to the size of the hole in air to have the right air-fuel mixture. Let's talk about why this big jet probably doesn't work so good. Well, if the throttle plate is closed, we don't have a lot of air. But if this orifice is sitting right on top of this thing with the throttle plate closed, even though we may have 13 pounds of atmosphere here, what's going to happen is this thing starts to taper down and this hole gets really small. So we're dealing now with a hole this big, right? You may drop the pressure all the way down to like 4 psi right at this point. You are going to have a lot of pressure differential, and this thing's going to pull up a lot of fuel, but it's not going to pull up a lot of that. This throttle plate is restricting the amount of air. You're going to have a rich condition. Okay. So right, what do you think would happen on the opposite side of this thing? And let's say that the jet's a little restrictive in this case. That now the throttle plate is wide open. Now what happens is the pressure may only drop and we're going to say this is also let me also add one other condition here that will add some other significance to this discussion, because there's quite a bit of stuff happening here all at once. That this would assume that here's your intake valve. We're going to assume that the engine is at 1,000 RPM. In other words, it's at idle on most engines or close to idle. That if the throttle plate's wide open and you're at idle, man, you're under a heavy load because it's not accelerating. But what's going to happen is that if this jet is only designed to handle enough fuel for whatever the breathing characteristic is, and we'll say this is at 10 CFM, the engine can pull 10 cubic feet per minute of air at 1,000 RPM. This jet is jetted pretty close to that size for that CFM if you were to calculate the ratio back out. What's going to happen is that if the throttle plate's pretty far to closed, where you have good pressure differential, maybe you have the right amount of air and the right amount of fuel, it's going to work out pretty close. But as you start to open up this throttle, what's going to happen is that now there's not enough air volume. You don't get enough pressure differential, and maybe this thing's at 13.7. You're only working on a pound of pressure differential because you have this giant hole and you don't have enough air moving through the motor. And then on top of that, you don't have enough. You don't have a lot of working pressure to push fuel, right? So the higher this pressure is, the more fuel comes out of that hole. This pressure's on the opposite side. So the two things are working against each other, right? So what would happen in this condition, as I start to open up the throttle, and assuming that the RPM didn't change, that would mean that it would have to be on like some sort of brake dyno or something, that the thing would get inherently leaner. So what do carburetors actually do? So the reason that they have, right, and that's the reason why I said your S&S carburetor with one circuit, well, I said they suck, which really isn't fair. They're just hard to tune. Why a carburetor they have different circuits in them. So they'll usually have an outlet circuit, and right, so I'm just going to redraw some of this stuff and show you how a few of the other circuits work. So down here, they've got 2 holes, 3 holes actually, but I'm going to draw it as 2. And I'm just going to label this as B for bypass port. And then in front of it is actually got another hole that's called the outlet port. This is all in the book. And that from here, this passage, if this kind of makes sense, comes down and has a little jet in it that sits down into the fuel. This is called your low speed, and guys, me trying to draw on these tablets, I'm not writing all this stuff out. That's your low speed jet. That's your pilot jet. So what happens with this particular circuit is that if the engine's idle and the throttle plate is, we'll say 90% closed, and that if I actually draw this correctly, this isn't drawn. It's not. This is actually kind of important. I still didn't get it right. Bear with me. I was concentrating on something else. Like I said, this stuff isn't scripted. I'm thinking ahead. So the throttle plate is here. Throttle plate is, we're going to say that throttle plate is 90% closed. There's a little opening here. You usually want the opening kind of towards the bottom, not at the top. Depends on, so these plates can be offset a little bit. They may not be perfectly center in the bore. That this has a little open space, so we have air. This amount of fuel is for at idle only. So if you had an engine that was only idling at 650 RPM, that's your idle circuit. What happens is I start to open up the throttle and the engine goes from 650 RPM to, let's say, 1500 RPM. Well, I've got more air, I'm going to need more fuel. So then what happens is as this throttle plate starts to open a little bit further, then it exposes these other 2 holes. So again, we transition between, and actually the way it works, it's not like this hole stops flowing. This hole adds to this hole, and that now you got the net flow of all 3 ports at that RPM. So it's like, cool. So now we've got something that would maintain air-fuel mixture relative to those 2 RPM conditions. But the same thing would happen if I only had these 2 circuits and I whacked the throttle wide open and the RPM's low. That's where you get that big old bog. Blah. S and N, baby. And those things bog in the middle. They do, man. And I'm sorry to hound on S and N. If you're a tech and you got to try to work on these things and people complain that they have a hesitation, it's like, yeah, bro, they do, man. It's how they designed it. Customers don't like that. They want their carburetors to work. So the next part of this is that generally what they'll have this will be kind of like the main jet circuit. And that this main jet circuit generally has a little hoodie on it, just so you know, to really create pressure differential, they do that, right? Because this thing, when this plate is over here, this is creating the differential. This has got a little hoodie to create better vacuum off of it, and that's super important. That little, don't jack with that. Don't pull that off because you think you can make more power. No worky. So then what'll happen is, we'll talk about mechanical slides. What they'll do, what is oftentimes designed, is that you have a throttle plate, and then what happens is you have a slide with a needle. And this slide, if it's a mechanical slide, kind of has like some wheels and some linkage, right? And then this whole mechanism is controlled by your throttle, right? Right? It doesn't matter if it's your car, your motorcycle, your ATV. And this has a rate. This will move first, typically, and then this will start to move second. So what'll happen is that this is opening. As soon as you get to a certain point, this starts to open. This has got a tapered needle with a nozzle